East Kansas that combines, I would say, classical academics with a work program on a sustainable farm here. It's situated on the property that I grew up on. And so I'm here on my north porch, and the school is over yonder about 200 yards. And so this is the family's land, and we've just completed year 2 at St. Martin's. And this next year, we will finally have a full complement of 4 classes, 9th through 12th grade. And this last year, we had 30 students. We'll probably be in the 40 to 45 range this next year. And we'll cap out around 60 ultimately in another year or so. So this book, and I don't want to jump ahead too much, Jason, but this book, Shop Classes Soulcraft, I think was recommended to me by William Fahey, who is the president of Thomas More College for the Liberal Arts up in New Hampshire. And Dr. Fahey if he recommends a book, I get it and I read it. And he hasn't let me down yet. And this book, he recommended this book and then one called Beauty in the Word by Stratford Caldecott that I had not read prior to that. And those 2 books, along with some writings from Dr. John Sr. and Father Edward Lean, those books were really helpful for us as we were considering our own pedagogy and beginning to articulate that as we were opening up our doors. But this book, which is kind of it's just an unexpected delight.
Yeah.
And it's been absolutely invaluable for us as we've thought about our work program. And
well, I'm going to cut you off. Okay. Cause you need to describe what some of the young men, part of their education, I think in one of your emails or articles or something, you described it as a classical liberal arts work program or something to that effect. And I know naturally, and then of course you just mentioned 3 other books that I think are quintessential for those in the formation of young men, especially if you guys are signing on for homeschoolers. The homeschool world, when it comes to fathers, acts as if we actually don't exist. When we get catalogs in the mail, I can't help but notice how the opening editorials and all the advertising is directly to moms, as if the father is literally abstracted. I actually think that has something to do with the content of this book. He doesn't mention it, but it's there. So to set this up, if you all didn't get this book, if you're not a brother subscriber, obviously we recommend it. But the author, Crawford, Matthew B. Crawford, the way he finds his way to this book, and actually the way he sets it up, is him wrestling with the very purpose of his education. So it's interesting you're reading it at your school, but he doesn't go about, and if any of you out there have read some of the distributist literature or some of the Back to the Land books, in the American lexicon of Back to the Land books, there's 10 Acres Enough, The Simple Life, and then we've got the modern day Joel Salatin, where people take a really quick scalpel and critique, maybe more of a baseball bat, to essentially the office worker and those of us that are abstracted from physical labor. I think both of us should admit. So I work full-time for Fraternus, which publishes Sword&Spade. Most of my work is done on a computer right here like we're doing now. Interestingly, though, my family, we live on a grade 8. Well, we live on a farm. That started as a homestead maybe 7 years ago. We spent our last little bit of money on milk cows, which was either a huge mistake or a great grace. I don't know what we were thinking. I'm not recommending that course, but we were essentially studying. I was studying for a graduate degree. My wife said, well, where do you see us in 5 years? I said, on a farm. And we got there, and we've been at it for about 7 years. We went from kind of not sharecropping, but bartering where we lived we were living on a farm, And then we had our own homestead, literally 3 acres and a cow, the famous distributist. I mean, it was actually 3.1 acres and a cow. And then we bought another farm, a bigger farm with my father that allowed us to expand into a grade A dairy where we sell yogurt and raw milk. So we also raise a lot of pigs. I would say we have chickens, but they're actually just free, and I don't ever know where they're going to lay their eggs because I got weary of caring for them. We have milk cows and kids. Come on, chickens are over. They're killing me. But
so what kind of milk cows do you have, Jason?
We have Jerseys, of course.
All right, good.
You guys have Jerseys, right?
We do.
Okay. So I'm situating that so that, and I think Matthew Crawford does a really good job of going at the heart of the problem of us being abstracted from physical labor and skill and craftsmanship without being any kind of machismo, nonsensical bashing of those that find themselves, because both of us are on farms right now, but that's not our main work, depending on how you look at work. He is very much defending the practical nobility of work itself. So I wanted to open with that because he doesn't tell his story right at the beginning. He just kind of jumps into what it's like being a motorcycle mechanic. And in case you missed it, he's a educated philosopher, but as he tells his story, it's flip-flopping back and forth between these two. He seems to have a genuine love of truth, which is the reason he pursued an education, which he is unable to dislodge from his experience as a man of work, especially as a mechanic. So anyway, Dan, I don't know if you want to, what was your thought as the beginning of it? He goes, the chapters go, a brief case for the manual arts, for the useful arts. And that's where he talks about manual competency, being able to do something. And then he goes from there to the separation of thinking and doing, how that came about. And he does all this before he even tells his own story, which is compelling.
Well, I think it's
worth chapter to be master of one's own stuff.
Right. I think it's worth sharing his story right out of the gates, in case any in our audience haven't read it. So Crawford is I think an exceptionally interesting character. He grew up in some sort of commune.
Yeah.
Right?
He doesn't quite explain all that. Yeah, he just mentions it.
He doesn't get into a lot of detail, but it's obvious that there was a period of disenchantment from his commune when he was 14 or 15, and he struck out on his own and became an electrician. And then he got into cars and hot rodding, and then he went and got a master's at the University of Chicago. And then he went back and did some kind of clerical work, writing abstracts. And then he went back and he got a PhD. Was it in philosophy at the University of Chicago?
In philosophy. Yeah.
Right. And so the key moment is that as soon as he gets his PhD, he gets hired by this prestigious think tank in DC.
Yeah.
And he's getting paid a lot of money. Right. And he goes there and he thinks, okay, I'm taking my place now in contributing to the kind of intellectual life and the greater conversation that is going on culturally. Right? And getting paid very handsomely to do it. And so he goes to DC, he's doing this work in a think tank, and he finds the work to be so mind-numbing and stultifying that I think he lasts 4 or 5 months before he bails out and becomes a motorcycle mechanic.
Right.
And that's what he
really
does.
Again. Yeah. Well, what's hilarious, and I got to be honest, this is where I find I almost feel like a friendship with this guy, or like, yes, I understand that he's introduced to mechanics when he's working on. He has a mentor. Yeah, he's in this commune he doesn't describe, And you pick up these little hints. He seems to come from a sort of a politely liberal post-Christian like ethos of his upbringing. And then, but he finds himself really grounded in like Aristotelian, philosophy. So he kind of goes real deep Western, and then he loves motors. I mean, that's pure American right there. Not, I mean, foreign motorcycles he mentions too, but he's
Gearhead.
Yeah, he's a gearhead. And that's the but when he's in school, and then I think when he's at because he goes to school the first time, and then he gets writing abstracts. And that's where he's paid like 30 grand a year or something. But he says he feels like he has to take that job because he has to use his degree. He's got this degree, and he feels like, well, this is the kind of work you do when you have a degree. And like, I'm going to enter the polite meritocracy of college educated people. And he's slowly coming to grips with the uselessness of his degree and how he's finding himself in this just below the managerial class of the work. And that, he kind of comes to grips with, my college degree was proving that I could enter this world of sitting at a desk and cranking out something all day long. So he's there, and then I don't know why he goes to get the PhD in philosophy exactly, although he mentions briefly, I wanted someone to help me read a book.
No, that was it. And
yeah.
it was one of the best reasons I've ever heard expressed about why you would go to college or go to a graduate program.
I wanted someone to help him to read.
Yeah, I was reading some difficult books, and I wanted somebody to help me read them well.
Yeah, but when he's at I don't know if it's when he's at the think tank, but he continues to rent some sort of illegal, like underground mechanic space where he barters. He allows the janitor lets him have these like flammable solvents under the stairs if he leaves a 6-pack of beer.
Right.
Or so he's always living this life that he's back and forth struggling with. Well, the trajectory of modern society is clearly towards the meritocracy, the technocracy, like I need to be educated and be a part of the trajectory of society. Yet he has this addiction to engines and motors, and he keeps cultivating that. And eventually, I think the think tank is when he said he realized that those who funded the think tank seemed to have predetermined outcomes of his, research and writing and such. And he was paid a lot essentially to confirm industrial propositions, I guess.
That's right. And the key, well, I mean, and I think the delightful and unexpected turn that his career takes, gets to the heart of, in many ways, what the book is about, which is that the manual arts and manual competence is, in some ways, more intellectually stimulating and sort of gives a broader scope for creativity and problem solving and engagement than most of the so-called thinking work that is done in offices.
Mm-hmm.
And that, that was such a delightful thing to read, because the trades are, I think we typically, look down our noses at the trades as really not being worthy of someone who is intelligent, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's like if you're a plumber, it's because you couldn't score high enough on the SAT and go to college, and so you had to settle for plumbing or being an electrician or being a welder.
Right.
And he just turns that on its head and says, actually, that kind of work in today's society, where doing and thinking are deliberately separated, and that's something we ought to go into some detail, that this kind of work is more mentally stimulating and finally satisfying. That was just a great point that he makes.
Yeah,
and he makes it so powerful.
it was interesting. You know, I'm preparing the next issue of Sword&Spade on work, and a lot of the authors are, you know, I guess they kept calling it intellectual work, or
Yeah.
blue collar versus white collar.
Yeah.
Basically, is there a tool or a desk involved? And I was fascinated how many of them, I edited it out, some of these, and I said, because I think you haven't thought about the distinction you're making very clearly. I'm not trying to be flippant here, but you just said, the one of the writers, and I'm not throwing him under the bus or anything. I said it to his face already. Is he literally said, "Well, I enjoyed this work I did growing up on the farm, but I knew I was going to go to college, so I wasn't going to do that kind of work." And it was literally, all education liberates you from anything physical, from any kind of labor. You're going to be liberated by college from the drudgery of work. And the other thing is, when people made the distinction, white collar, blue collar, or they literally said intellectual work versus manual work. And sadly, I think even John Paul II in his encyclical makes that distinction. I said, do you think someone framing a wall is not using their mind? You know, I don't want a wall framed by someone not using their mind. And I think my own appreciation in that, and you use the example of the plumber, my father, who literally, he was sitting awkwardly outside my desk. I wish he'd found somewhere else to go. He did. He found, we're building a house right now, and he's a plumber.
Right.
And he's a retired chief plumbing inspector. His father was a scientist. My grandfather invented such things as AstroTurf and all detergent, ALL detergent. But his character as a man, and the stories we tell in the family, is he also built houses on the side. And he was like an amateur horticulturist. And those were the things that seemed to round him out and make him grounded. And then we have my father, interestingly, he has this very practical, he was kind of the black sheep amongst the kids, I guess, because he didn't go to college, he went and became a plumber. But everyone calls him, you know, usually for plumbing questions, but you know, there's this very practical art. So anyway, when I'm talking to these people writing these issues, or these articles, you know, there was one of them who gave me a lot of pushback. I'm like, well, you know, I don't think people that labor in the field appreciate the work of, like, an engineer, was the example he was using. I said, that's true. You know, everyone, you know, feels like their work is not appreciated enough. I mean, and as my father says, everyone else's job is easy. You know, your own job's always hard. But what we came to see, the agreement we came to was, hey, the man laboring is not using his mind. His mind has to be engaged, or he's going to build a crooked wall or kill somebody. But those of us at our desks, our body becomes disengaged. You know, we pacify most of our senses in order to focus the mind. And there's a time for that. I mean, Aquinas calls it study. I mean, we literally have to, that's why even in prayer, we can settle the body. There's a need to, in a certain way, settle the physicality of humanity. But what happens if our work all day, 8, 9, 10, 11 hours a day, and then our amusement, like Netflix and the internet generally, becomes totally disengaged from not just the physical world, because everyone's like, oh, we need to get outside and smell nature and smell the roses and all that stuff. But what about work itself? What about physical work, when our employment and our amusement doesn't have any sort of whiff of craft or hobby or skill? What does that do to us? And I think he shows that it does. We don't give enough consideration to that if we're not having to tussle with reality, you know, right there.
Well, that tussling with reality is, you know, as you said earlier, Crawford seems to be a realist, right?
Yeah.
In kind of the original sense that was, you know, expressed by Plato and Aristotle, that there is an objective reality outside of yourself, that you're not the creator and master of that, that truth is getting your own mind and intellect in alignment with that external reality. And that when we when we live lives that are largely abstract and we can go through our lives without really bumping into the hard corners of reality. And we've done a pretty good job of that. I mean, suburbia, I think the whole point is, comfort and convenience, and to sort of soften those pointy edges of life. When you go through life like that, you can start to believe that you're kind of the master of the universe,
Yes.
right? And that, but when you're under the hood of a car, or when you're under a cow milking her, and she can kick the bucket, and you've got to be aware of, does she have mastitis? What's going on? I mean, you are preoccupied just by force, preoccupied with something outside of yourself, with this external reality. And that is a very good thing.
Yeah, he says he calls it unselfing.
Yeah.
And I think he's quoting somebody else, but I was fascinated because the technological order of things, which we live on our screen every day. I struggle with that. We live on our screen. When I press the F key, an F shows up on my screen every time, right? So there's this sort of mastery and this post, he doesn't talk about Descartes, but trying to make everything mathematical. He actually says, page 82, in a sense then, a mathematical representation of the world renders the world as something of our own making. Whereas the person working, he says, it requires a certain disposition towards the thing you're trying to fix. And the disposition is humility. You didn't make it. You don't own it. And when you're a mechanic or a carpenter or a plumber, you even don't get to enjoy the use of it afterwards. It's this total humble receptivity, but it's also active, right? So it's not total. It's not a receptivity as far as I'm passive to the world. I'm actively engaged in it. And I've always been fascinated theologically, what does it mean to be receptive to God's existence, God's reality? A lot of times, especially in the modern world, especially in the West, it's represented as essentially feminine, right? That the feminine is very receptive, therefore receptivity is feminine. But the Son, right, when he comes to reveal the face of the Father, he says, I'm about my Father's business. He has been working, and he also says he's been working since the beginning of time. I'm continuing that work. So he's totally receptive, but he's active in it, right? As a son, there's this and he touches on it, on the issues of masculinity, but he knows the work he's talking about is for men, right? That they really, while there are exceptions and that are not any kind of violations of the precepts, there's still the very masculine quality of his book. That men in the element of work, if you've ever been around a bunch of mechanics trying to figure out what's wrong, they're not prideful. They have a unity amongst themselves. They're all humble. No one can just jump in there. They're trying to figure out and talk about, well, it could be this, but if we take that off, then we got to replace the gasket of this, and we might cause a leak here, but it'll tell us if it's that. I mean, it's fascinating to, get in the. And I'm a terrible mechanic, just so you know. I was tinkering with my tractor for like months, unable to get it to start. And my neighbor, who I think anyone would look at his property, which is it's cliche, full of cars. There's a donkey in the front yard named Booger. It's just junk everywhere. But he's brilliant, and he was able to come over and kind of figure out that the ground wire from the battery to the body was not allowing enough amperage to turn the diesel motor over. And diesel does not have a spark, so it has to have enough power to a lot of people don't know, diesel doesn't have spark, so it has to compress the fuel enough to make it explode. And he said there wasn't enough amps to compress it enough to get the explosions going. But anyway, the humility, he's got to come to the tractor. He can't master it. He's got to receive what's going on there.
Yeah, and along those lines, so Crawford makes this point that mechanics, surgeons, I would put in veterinarians, people who deal with, who are dealing with animals and diagnosing health issues, farmers he calls it a stochastic art.
Yeah,
do you remember this?
Yeah, stochastic. Yeah.
I don't know where that comes from. I'm going to try to move out of the wind. There's a little wind that's brewing up here.
Your green screen is blowing. It's messing up the microphone.
If you hear wind, I can move further. Okay, so let me know.
No, you're good. You're good.
But he talks about the stochastic arts as being arts that are where you're constantly bumping up against failure. Mm-hmm. Doctors, patients are dying. Their systems are their bodies are breaking down. They're working with those bodies, but those bodies are breaking down. You're constantly bumping up against failure, and that, I think, in the stochastic arts, as he says in particular, failure is great for humility.
Yeah.
And a lot of I think in education today, a lot of what we try to do, and parents, I think we try to do this because we want to protect our kids. We try to keep them from experiencing failure. And one of the greatest lessons you can learn is just how to deal gracefully with failure. How are you going to ever learn? I don't know how you're going to learn humility if you're always insulated from falling down.
Yeah. Well, think about, I'm sorry.
You're good.
Think about how he talks about failure. I think he ends the book with the need for failure in education, that it teaches you a disposition of humility towards all of reality, right? That you're predisposed to approach almost every situation humbly trying to figure out what's going on, that you're not the master of it. And that doesn't mean you're not confident, right? Because once you've experienced failure and then you've overcome it, I've seen that in my sons. I see that in the guy, we also host retreats on our farm for young men and college students. And it's amazing. A lot of them have never experienced manual labor. And it's great for them to be in the context of a farm where they can do a job they've never done. And I promise them up front, I'm not going to condemn you for not knowing how to do something you've never done before. But what's amazing is that they're disposed to be embarrassed by failure and to avoid it at all costs. And when he goes into the managerial culture of big corporations, and he says it breeds and then necessarily irresponsibility. I mean, no one can be responsible. So you speak in vague language that can be interpreted in lots of different ways.
Right.
Wendell Berry says, you talk like people that don't want to be understood, right? That's what he calls business language. That what you're doing is you're always leaving language open to reinterpretation to make it not your fault.
Yep.
And he talks, and when you fail, it's like you realize, oh, it's this disposition of humility, and the literal get back on the horse again is how you build the character. But think about if the educational system mirrors the managerial class, whereas you're trying, and he says that the job of managers is not to get a job done, it's to manage the psychological and emotional well-being of his subjects. So he talked about like Michael Scott in The Office, the show. He's the one, the manager's not the one making sure you're selling paper. He's making sure you're happy about, the office and you like other people. And
about Dunder Mifflin, protecting the brand.
The Dunder Mifflin. And they become this mythical, arbiter of culture and morality itself. But I think our educational system mirrors this. No failure, no condemnation, no acknowledging responsibility, which is, I remember going from, so just my background, I went to a community college for a trade, went out, did that trade for a while, ended up going back to school, and now I have a master's in theology. So I felt a lot of what the tension that he feels in these things. And one of the things that was fascinating is when I started reading, I'm in these office jobs, so I'm reading these business books. They start talking about taking responsibility for your actions as if it's some heroic feat to acknowledge you did something wrong. Whereas on the job site, if you build the wall crooked, knock the freaking wall down. You built it wrong, build it again. Whereas like in these business books, it's like hey, that leader right there, they take the blame when things go wrong. Like, well, what else are they going to do? But I think in the managerial class, it's heroic to blame yourself for a mistake. I mean, whose is it?
That's right. So Bishop Sheen said something along the lines that maturation comes about principally through two things: suffering and responsibility. Right? So doing hard things, coming up against the hard realities of the hard corners and edges of life, and then responsibility. And I think that the manual arts in particular, that's a great place for both of those things to occur, right? I mean, to do hard things and to take responsibility, because as you say, there's no hiding. Either the engine turns over and starts or it doesn't, right?
Yeah, that's right.
If you don't, we tell our boys here at the school that there are real consequences if they don't do their job, right? I mean, if the cow doesn't get watered or doesn't get milked, you have mastitis, or you have a dead cow.
Yeah.
There are real consequences here, and there's real opportunity, therefore, for responsibility. Success or failure is objective, right? It's not this subjective thing that happens more in the office space, right?
Yeah.
That cow's dead.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. And as a father, I find it, there's this constant, we hear a lot of Catholic dads, we want to be better. We want to be better. We want to be good dads. Of course. We want to be a good father. And it's like, but what does that mean? And you'll hear from the Pope, be a great, the father is the most important, but what do I do? Do I just tell them stuff? I don't really know what to do. I don't know. Is that an informational problem? Can I get a brochure that, but on the farm with my sons and my one daughter, sorry, I say sons a lot because we have 5 sons and 1 daughter. Not that order. It was 1 daughter, then 5 sons in a row. The great thing about having the farm, and you mentioned milking the cow, my son Henry, this probably a year and a half ago, is like, all right, you graduated to the barn now. And he milks with me every day. In fact, actually, he milks a lot without me if something needs to be done. And the great thing of having this thing outside of both of us is it doesn't become me trying to both tear down his potential ego and pride and build him up at the same time. We can look at the situation and say, well, the reason she has mastitis is because that she needs to be milked out better in the back than in the front. You already know that about Abigail. We've had her 7 years. You know that about this cow, and you didn't. So you left a little bit of milk in, and now she's got mastitis. That's a mistake you made, and that's a problem, right? So we need to correct that. And the other day, we had a fresh cow, and milking a fresh cow is always, they're always kind of tense when you start getting the calf around and they're mooing and they just had a baby and they hadn't been milked in a while. And he handled getting the calf separated, getting the cow in the barn, and milking her by himself. I was able to praise something totally legitimate that he achieved, that if he didn't have the opportunity to achieve it, how would really ask ourselves, how do we go about praising achievement when there isn't one? Right? So, there was these seminarians at the church the other day, and all the church ladies were swarming them. I said, I just want you to know, I'm not going to swarm you and congratulate you. You're just in college. I went to college. You haven't done anything. Maybe when you're ordained, we'll talk. But, you got to make it. But he's achieving something, and he has failures and success. And because it's outside of us, it's not just me trying to formulate, how do I properly
artificially prop up his self-esteem?
Artificially, yeah. Prop up his, I want him to be confident, but not too much. And, the manual arts, and I'm not trying to be, I don't know another way. I don't know how this can happen in an entirely artificial. And there's actually the framers helping us today. One of them said, my children don't go outside. They stay on screens all day. and I don't know what to do about it. And I'm thinking, they need to be framing with you. What do you mean you don't know what to do about it?
Yeah. Yeah.
They're not going to have the same ethic he does.
You know, John Sr. said somewhere, or this may be hearsay, but said that everything he learned could be finally expressed in the Benedictine motto of ora et labora.
Yeah.
Like that kind of contained the truth of everything. And I think the labora has to just be part of the human experience, particularly in formation, or you're going to be you're going to be malformed.
Right. It is. So, and by the way, some of the people on the call, you guys are asking questions. And yes, we can answer some of these. Some of them are coming in as questions and some of them as on the chat. I don't know the difference between a chat and a question, but, that answers some of them. Let's see right there. Yeah. So the relationship of us to the world is one of work, right? So that's literally how God relates to creation, to the material world itself. He said, this is my handiwork, right? And then we get here, we show up, go till and keep. And then that exists before and after the fall. So it's our relationship to the world is one of work. That's how it relates. So I don't think, and somebody asked, do you think that being on computers all the time has made us less creative? And I would say, yeah, the work of being creative has to be in touch with creation, right? So you might be creative in the context of the screen, but the screen is a form, right? It's as the famous Matthew McLuhan, or Mark McLuhan, I don't remember his first name. The media is the message. That I actually personally, I was horrified at the idea of watching mass on a screen, or even worse, going to adoration on the screen. I'm not, okay, if anyone on here, I'm not trying to tear down your ego here, but to think that you're actually doing something, right? That now that we can order anything we want from Amazon, we can get Instacart or get our food. And now we can even get our prayer through the screen. That what is the message of the media is that life comes through this, and there's something in that that's horrifying to me, that the idea, and I think as a culture and a society that we would be satisfied or I don't want to say satisfied. I don't think people that are watching mass on a screen would always say it was better. I think there probably are going to be some people that say, you know what, this staying home in my jammies and watching mass is pretty nice. And I don't think any Sunday obligations are coming back anytime soon. So, the thought that we are somehow can check off the box that we haven't gathered as a people, right? As that it didn't matter that Peter wasn't at the cross and John was, right? That being in the presence of something. So anyway, we're getting I'm going haywire here. But yes, I think to get all these things and to have our work on the screen, I'm finding it more and more in my life, especially as a father with a family, that it's bad. It is bad for us as human persons, made in the image of God, to not work together. We can do other things. We can have, and he talks about, when, we're in conflict when our work degrades us. So we have to climb Mount Everest. He talks about the banker who, sort of hates his existence. So he has to do these crazy existential climb Mount Everest to balance out the rest of his life, where our work and our leisure become acts of balancing, where we're trying to do the drudgery and misery of work so that we can, go boating all day.
Right. And I think work is when people work together. Just this morning, one of our faculty members, he and his wife both work at the school, and this was their first year here, and they're building a house about 2 miles away here from campus. And it's great because this guy, Mr. Bauer, has no experience in construction. He was a Division I soccer player. He got a master's in physics. He's become the farm foreman here because he's just an unbelievable worker. It's extraordinary. they're building a house, and Ryan's building it, right? And so this morning we went out, the whole faculty gathered at 8 o'clock this morning to stand up the walls, about 50 foot long walls, kind of an Amish barn raising sort of event. And there's just really nothing like it for, you know, the word community gets overused. I don't know what else to use though, but that's what community looks like.
Well,
right?
it's the word community gets overused because we don't have it, right? I always notice that like churches that sing songs about we are community are the ones that don't have it.
I know,
but
they're longing for it though.
Yeah, it gets created though naturally, also through our work. I mean, that's a whole. He does get towards the end of it. At the end of the book, that the guy sitting on the cooler who's an apprentice for the construction workers, he wants to join their community, whether or not, whatever the pay, and so work becomes the entrance into, it's just totally different from the managerial class, which is, you don't want to get caught up in the, humanity and actual craft of certain things. You've got to be able to just manage.
Yeah, look at what's going on there in the community is what we're really aiming for, and what is deep in the heart, in all of our hearts, is a desire for friendship. And that friendship, I think, working with other people forges friendship better than just about anything I can think of. In my experience at St. Gregory's Academy, we played rugby, and that was a kind of work. It was a kind of work, or it was battle. And you took responsibility, and there was suffering, those things that Bishop Sheen talks about. And through that kind of intense shared experience of responsibility and suffering, the friendships, the kind of camaraderie that was the fruit of that, was just something I had never experienced before in my life, and I really haven't since, except for in glimpses of it in when I work with other men, especially, doing hard physical work. And so that's something that's a gift. That gift of friendship, or the opportunity for it, is something that is very much part of the mission of St. Martin's, and that is largely afforded us through the work program. Right? It's not just talking about things, but it's doing things together.
Yeah. So tell us real quick, when they leave the school, you actually have them trained specifically in a trade, right?
Well, one of the things that we have is a certified construction trades program. So when they leave the school, they will have the opportunity to have a 2-year construction trade certification that is accredited through the local junior college here. They'll know how to frame a house. They'll know the basics of construction, and it's a serious program. And we have our week looks a little bit different than most weeks for schools, in that Wednesday we call Work Wednesday. We don't have classes on Wednesday. We turn out for a full morning of work on the farm, where we take on larger projects like building fence, or if we're going to butcher a couple hundred chickens or butcher a hog. Those events where those projects where you can't get that done in 30 minutes, no matter how many guys or folks you have, right? By the time you line out your tools and kind of get your marching orders, it's time to pack your tools back up and go in, So you need longer windows of time to do these larger scale projects. And then in the afternoon, we turn to some kind of manual craft. And what we've been doing is this construction trades program, where the boys we're building things that are used here on the farm, right? We're building hay cribs, we're building greenhouses, we're building chicken coops, and we're about to build bunkhouses where the boys are actually going to live. They'll be participating in the construction of their own bunkhouses this fall.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. You said we get a lot of people coming to the farm for various reasons, or even those that are in like seminary formation. And, part of seminary formation is supposed to be, what they call human formation. But I've even seen, it's funny, that seems to become a field trip exercise where you go and you see work going on. You might do 30 minutes of it and you have somebody talk about it, waxing eloquently. But I find those are almost, that's a field trip. You haven't really experienced anything that's grounded you, right? That's put your feet on the ground. Because, when we had the college students here for a week, I had a guy come out, he literally said he was putting in a fence, and I showed him how to build an H-brace, and they built this H-brace, and they did it wrong. So I came over with a pair of bolt cutters and cut the wire and and shook it loose, and I, start over, and they did it again. And he said, I never knew why playing video games in my basement was lame. and I didn't know why. He said, this is awesome. And he's building a fence. I mean, as I like to joke when they show up, either this is a brilliant exercise of human formation, or this is a huge scam because you just paid me to work on my farm. I mean, this is, it's one of those, or maybe both. But when you said, you can't do it 30 minutes at a time, you really have to be a part of it. And my trade school that I went to was actually in horticulture, and you every day for hours, the whole afternoon typically, was in the garden. So it's kind of this, the whole theory and practice, but we almost romanticize the practice as if it's like, that's nice to have an example, like a field trip every now and then, but like you really, for your own moral, ethical, intellectual formation, if you're not doing it with your hands, you're not really doing it. You haven't really achieved anything. You actually had to stay on campus at my school 2 weeks out of every semester. You and a friend had to stay on the campus. And that was kind of a semi boot camp because everybody would like leave their trash around as a test on if you would pick it up, because you had to get up at like 6 a.m. and because there's 32 acres of gardens that we maintained.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. So it was, it was a lot of work, but so
some good questions.
I have an interesting question that came in. I'd like to put it to you. Somebody said, I'm curious if Dr. Kerr.
I'm not a doctor. I'm not a doctor.
Oh, I'm calling you Dr. Kerr from now on. Dr. Kerr.
That was my dad.
His opinion. I feel we have a society that puts such a strong focus on science facts, but that the most important contribution that science offers for young men and adults is often neglected, which is the ability to teach the skill of observation. This goes with Mr. Craig's, I'm just Mr. I didn't get doctor.
Nope. Sorry, buddy.
Mr. Craig's comment that God speaks to us through the natural world and work, but what can we learn about these insights from God into the workings of our world without a strong foundation in the observational skills that can be applied throughout our daily lives? Would you mind commenting on John Sr.'s poetic knowledge, your focus on observation, I believe you call it at the school, and the sort of stargazing educational model of Senior?
Yeah, I love this question. This is a brilliant question.
Well, because you got a PhD from the question.
I got a PhD out of the deal. I love this.
Hey, I'm going to charge you for that, by the way.
Well, okay. So I think there's a lot to say about this. And this question about observation gets back to what Crawford talks about when there's a reality external to yourself, and you have to get out. What does he call it? Unselfing. You have to get outside of yourself, and you have to direct your gaze onto something outside, external to you, right? He calls that attentiveness. And one of the 4 pedagogical commitments that we have here at St. Martin's is to develop the habit of attentiveness, or as Jason puts it, observation. I think they're very closely allied, right? And that's something that we do practically in our science program, and we do it through we do it through a lot of things, including stargazing. All the work on the farm, for the reasons we've described, force you to get outside of your own mind and to focus on things like the cow that you're sitting alongside as you're milking and wondering if she's going to kick over the bucket. One of the things that we do, though, directly in our science program is something called the sit spot, which is a quiet spot that the boys pick out. And we have about 200 acres here on the property. And at least once a week, if not more, they sit for about 45 minutes to an hour just in quiet observation with a journal. And they record their observations, and we ask them to do things like list what is the softest, smallest noise that you can hear, right? And we ask them to do these things that engage all of their senses in what's going on around them. And it's interesting because at the beginning, especially for the freshmen, they do it and they're bored. They think it's silly. What am I doing? This is a waste of time. And then gradually they start noticing things. They start noticing birds. They start noticing airplanes going overhead. They start seeing changes that are occurring in the seasons, and they get kind of enthusiastic about it. And they're beginning to develop the art of noticing, right? The art of noticing what's around them. Sherlock Holmes said, I don't see anything more than anyone else. I've just taught myself to notice what I see.
Yeah.
Right? And so that kind of habit of gazing on the world around you and noticing details and getting kind of outside of your own head is something that is really at the core of the science program. And frankly, it's at the core of everything we do. And here's why. So this comes from Stratford Caldecott in Beauty and the Word talks about this, and we just ripped it off of Caldecott. He references Simone Weil, this French mystic and philosopher who wrote an essay on attentiveness and said that finally attentiveness is sort of really the main project of all education. Mm-hmm. Because attentiveness, which again is rooted in this gaze outside of yourself, at the same posture that you take when you're attentive is the very posture that you take in prayer, and that attentiveness is at the heart of prayer. And because prayer is the highest activity that we are called to in this, here and in the next life. But that's the highest activity that we're called to. Prayer is this sort of posture of receptivity and a kind of waiting on the other. But it's also active in that you're looking and you're searching, right? And so for us, in realizing, in that pedagogical commitment to develop attentiveness, it's not just so we can, identify birds or whatever's around us, or come up with, cool sort of observational tricks. It is so that we can develop a posture and an attitude that is conducive to prayer, right? And when we live in a world of so much distraction, where our attention spans are so minuscule and gnat-like, it's very difficult to pray. I have to say it's difficult for me to pray because I live in a world of distraction. I'm on my computer a lot.
Not me.
I know, not you. But I find it hard, and I think that I think this generation that grows up looking at screens and just kind of cultivating distractions, outsourcing your imagination to something else, we're just crippling ourselves when it comes to a life of prayer and contemplation. Okay, so then to tie that in, I can stop there, but to tie that into the poetic mode, there's this quote, I don't know if it's from Aristotle, I should know, shame on me. But basically the quote is, it's a quote in Latin. Let me see if I can pull it up here real quick. Shame on me. Nihil in intellectu nisi prius in sensu. Nothing in the intellect unless first in the senses. Nothing in the intellect unless first in the senses. That's the heart. I mean, I think that's sort of the heart of what poetic knowledge is all about. Mm-hmm. Is that we can't start with these sort of abstracted principles and concepts. We need to have an intellect and an imagination that is richly filled with direct contact with reality, right? Particularly with the natural world, and the farm and field provide those theaters for that kind of contact, right? So the kind of the most, you know, Dr. We were talking before we started here about Dr. James Taylor's book, Poetic Knowledge. And I think his son, Adam, who is our assistant headmaster here at St. Martin's, is here on the chat with us. But he begins his book by referencing Dickens' Hard Times, right?
Of course, yeah.
And Hard Times opens with this schoolmaster, Gradgrind. And Gradgrind is only interested in facts, right? He says, give me facts. I want nothing but facts. Facts are the only thing that count. And he notices that there's a new student in his classroom, Sissy Jupe, right? So he confronts Sissy, and he finds out that Sissy's dad is something of a horseman. In fact, he comes from a circus, and he's the trainer of the horses and kind of runs the tricks with the horses in the circus. And Gradgrind says, Sissy, define a horse. Define a horse. She's so bewildered by the question. She's speechless. She can't even talk. She can't define a horse. She doesn't really even understand what that question means. Gradgrind seems pleased. He turns to one of his prize pupils, Bitzer.
Yeah, Bitzer.
Says, Bitzer, define a horse. Bitzer stands up and just rattles off this definition.
Quadruped.
Quadruped, gramnivorous, 42 teeth, 24 incisors, blah, blah, blah. Gradgrind's pleased, has Bitzer sit down and turns to Sissy and says, Sissy, now you know what a horse is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, of course, the reality, this was, Dr. Taylor points this out so beautifully in his book. The only person probably in that classroom who knew what a horse is or was Sissy.
Yeah. And I think her disposition of being silent in the face of the mystery of it, but also knowing it, that's because the funny thing about, you're describing receptivity, and by the way, it's 2:02. We're going to wrap this up.
All right, let's do it.
But the receptivity, we think, oh, well, that means like sort of being passive to stuff and just sitting there and thinking about it. And, the old joke about a philosopher falling in a hole while he's staring in the stars. But the opposite is actually true, that when the screens not only distract us, but I think the technological age, the word techne logos, it's sort of like the techne being like the work, the way we do it, and logos being the wisdom of it. We just go out and do stuff. We make the logos go on the end. Then we'll figure it out in the end, meaning we're more aggressive now with our assertion upon reality, our forcing what we want to be true. We can just force it to be true in the avatars of the screen. Mm-hmm. So we become more willing to spout off facts and tweets about what the world is or should be. And we're not silent in front of it, even though we're really working. My son and I, Henry, we milk every day, and there's not a whole lot to talk about with the cow, but we're there. And he always gets mad when I leave. And I say, well, I got to go do this. He's like, well, why do you care I'm leaving? He's like, I just want to be here with you. We're not saying anything,
Yeah.
So I think there's a paradox here. It sounds like we're talking about being passive to create, but it actually makes you less violently active towards the world itself, just dominating. You even listen to the language when people talk like business speak, like, you got to own it. You got to dominate, man. You killed that, man. That was killer. Like everything is like bringing death by destruction. Instead of, like what's a farmer going to say? Like, man, you really killed that field. It's like that. It's a whole different disposition.
Right. Right.
So in closing, I'd like to, just say, yeah, there's a couple guys, somebody noticed, one good call out on snowflake culture. Everybody wins. Absolutely. Somebody to Dan's point too, somebody said we lack amazement, which is true. John Senior, his
wonder. Yeah. Wonder.
One, he said, let them be born in wonder. That was his philosophy of education summed up. And then absolutely the attentiveness in prayer was brought up. I highly recommend, if anyone on this call did read this book and maybe got it because they're a subscriber or bought it because of this, read the book, and then maybe that Stratford Caldecott book would be a really good follow-up, because I think the great thing about Crawford is he doesn't put a false dichotomy between working and thinking and doing, and as if, he does ascend to truth for its own sake and his love of philosophy that's obvious in the book. But he never lets his feet get off the ground. I think that's the difference between this and a lot of books. And that Caldecott book, if you were to round it out with the sort of educational, so what exactly is education, what's happening, that would be a great follow-up.
Yeah. Also, Jason, real quick, this just came in the mail a couple days ago. Yeah.
You didn't send me one.
Yeah. Sorry. It was lost in the mail. This came out 3 days ago. It's brand new book. I think it's very much in the line of Shop Class's Soulcraft, but it has a particular sort of focus on automobiles. I think Crawford is just apoplectic at the prospect of self-driving automobiles.
Or I can't even grasp my wife. She is scandalized by a generation of men that don't even want cars.
Right.
That's another topic. All right. On that note, again, Jason Craig, St. Joseph's Farm, Sword&Spade magazine, Fraternus, and fan of Dr. Dan Kerr. Thank you all for attending our rambling discussion here. Dan, thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Let's do it again.
All right. Sounds good. I'm going to kick everybody off. I'll hang around here for a minute in case anybody has any questions. But I'm going to stop the recording here. So thanks guys for attending. God bless.